What if history isn't just missing pages, but entire voices? What if the stories of half the world, the stories of women, were deliberately, or even unconsciously, left out? In 1182, as the world teetered on the brink of new crusades and ancient kingdoms battled for dominance, how many women's thoughts, dreams, and powerful actions simply vanished from the record, as if they never existed. Number 1. The bias of the scribes and chroniclers. Imagine a world where the vast majority of people who held a quill in their hand, who painstakingly dipped it in ink and wrote down the events of the day, were men. Now imagine those men were often monks, scholars, or court officials, deeply embedded in a society that viewed women through a very specific lens. This wasn't just a casual oversight, it was a foundational issue in how history was created and preserved, particularly in the year 1182, and for centuries surrounding. Bias of the scribes and chroniclers was not always malicious, but it was profoundly impactful, acting as a filter through which all recorded knowledge had to pass. These men, the gatekeepers of the past, were products of their time. They were trained in monasteries and cathedral schools, steeped in theological teachings and classical texts that often presented women in highly stylized and limited roles. Women were frequently depicted as Eve, the temptress, or Mary, the pure mother, leaving little room for the complexities of real human beings who were actively shaping their world. When these scribes turned to record events, their minds were already conditioned to see certain things as important and others as irrelevant. Wars, dynastic marriages, papal decrees, and the exploits of kings and knights, these were the grand narratives that filled their parchment pages. Daily lives, the economic contributions, the intellectual pursuits, or even the political maneuverings of women, unless they directly impacted a male-centric event, were often deemed unworthy of permanent inscription. Consider, for example, the chronicles that detail the lives of medieval rulers. When a king made a decision, it was meticulously recorded. When a queen, however, exerted influence, her actions might be attributed to her husband's wisdom, or simply ignored as the domestic concerns of a woman. The queen acted as regent while her husband was away. Her decrees might be logged, but her personal motivations, her struggles, or her unique diplomatic skills would rarely be highlighted. Instead, the focus would remain on the male line of succession, the continuation of the dynasty, and the military prowess of her absent husband or son. The historical record, therefore, becomes a testament to what the male chronicler believed was important, not necessarily a comprehensive reflection of what truly transpired. Think of the Gesta Philippi Augusti, or the Deeds of Philip Augustus, a major chronicle of the French king who reigned around this period. While it offers immense insight into the political and military landscape of France, it largely glosses over the significant women in Philip's life, such as his various wives. Isabella of Hainault, his first wife and mother of Louis VIII, died in 1190, not long after 1182. Her role in securing the Artois territory for the French crown, a crucial expansion of royal power, was monumental, yet chroniclers often present her primarily as a means to a male heir or a political tool. Independent thought, her diplomatic acumen in managing her own dowry lands, or her personal ambitions often remain unwritten. This isn't because she lacked these qualities, but because the male chroniclers prioritized the king's narrative. Even when women were central to a story, their voices were mediated. Take the example of Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of the most powerful and influential women of the entire Middle Ages. She was Queen of France, then Queen of England, and mother to two English kings, Richard the Lionheart and John. Her life spanned nearly 80 years, filled with political intrigue, crusades, and courtly love. Yet even for someone of her unparalleled status, much of what we know about her comes through the lens of male writers, chroniclers, troubadours, and legal documents. We hear about her political interventions, her rebellions, her imprisonment, and her patronage, but her own direct words, her personal feelings, her strategic thinking in her own hand, are incredibly rare. The male chroniclers of her time, like Ralph of Daistow or Roger of Howden, certainly recorded her actions, but they did so with their own interpretations, biases, and often with an underlying tone of disapproval if her actions deviated from expected female subservience. Participation in the Second Crusade, for instance, was frequently depicted by male chroniclers as a disruptive or even unholy influence on the expedition, rather than acknowledging her legitimate authority and the presence of many noblewomen who accompanied their husbands. Moreover, the very language used by these scribes was steeped in patriarchal assumptions. Terms used to describe women in positions of power often subtly undermined their authority. A queen acting as regent might be described as ruling on behalf of her son, rather than ruling in her own right. A woman who spoke out forcefully in a legal dispute might be labeled as contentious or unwomanly, rather than assertive or just. This linguistic framing, preserved in the historical documents, further solidified a perception of female weakness or impropriety, even when the underlying actions demonstrated strength and capability. Choice of adjectives, the focus on certain details over others, all contributed to a skewed portrait. The records kept in monasteries were particularly significant. Monks removed from much of lay society often had strong opinions about the proper roles of women, derived from their monastic rules and theological studies. They might record the pious donations of a noblewoman to their abbey, noting her spiritual virtue, but they would rarely delve into the source of her wealth or her independent management of her estates, which were often key to her ability to make such donations. If an abbess managed a wealthy and influential convent, the chronicler might praise her administrative skills, but her intellectual contributions, her spiritual guidance to her sisters, or her engagement with broader intellectual trends would often be overlooked in favor of details about land holdings and monastic discipline. Beyond the formal chronicles, other types of records also suffered from this scribal bias. Legal documents, charters, and court records were all drafted by men. Even when a woman was a party to a contract or a legal case, her voice was typically filtered through a male proxy, her husband, father, or a male guardian. The document would record the transaction, but it would not capture her specific negotiations, her reasoning, or her individual agency in the matter. For instance, a land deed from 1182 might record that John, with the consent of his wife Mary, grants land to Richard, but it would never record Mary's arguments for or against the grant, her counter-proposals, or the complex social dynamics that led to her consent. Her presence is noted, but her voice is silent. Consider also the biographies of saints. Many medieval saints were women, venerated for their piety, miracles, and ascetic lives. Yet their vitae, or lives, were almost invariably written by male clerics. These biographers would often emphasize qualities that conformed to the Church's ideal of womanhood: humility, obedience, chastity, and passive suffering, sometimes at the expense of their more assertive or intellectually independent qualities. For example, if a saintly woman had a vision, the male scribe might interpret it through a lens of divine intervention that affirmed church doctrine, rather than exploring the woman's own psychological or theological insights. The original spiritual experience, therefore, was reinterpreted, polished, and presented in a way that aligned with male clerical authority, effectively silencing the woman's unique spiritual voice. The training of scribes itself fostered this bias. Scriptoriums were male spaces. The education received was classical, Latin-based, and focused on male authors and male history. There was little to no training in understanding or documenting the experiences of women from a female perspective. When they did encounter women, it was often through the limited archetypes provided by their religious and classical education. This systemic lack of exposure to female perspectives meant that even well-intentioned scribes were ill-equipped to capture the full spectrum of women's lives. In essence, the historical record for 1182 and the entire medieval period is not a complete mirror of the past. It is a highly curated collection of narratives, shaped by the perspectives, priorities, and prejudices of the men who wrote it down. Their selective vision and their unconscious biases acted as powerful tools of erasure, ensuring that the vibrant, complex, and often powerful voices of women were either minimized, reinterpreted, or simply left unspoken in the grand story of history. The absence of women's voices is not merely a gap, it is a profound testament to the power of those who controlled the pen. Number 2, social norms and expectations. Beyond the deliberate filtering by scribes, the very air women breathed in 1182 was thick with societal expectations that actively discouraged their voices from being heard, let alone recorded. These social norms were so deeply ingrained that they often didn't even need to be written down. They were understood rules that governed behavior and shaped what was considered appropriate for women. A woman's silence, her modesty, and her obedience were virtues highly prized, and any deviation from these ideals could lead to social ostracization, ridicule, or worse. This pervasive pressure meant that many women may have self-censored, choosing to remain silent rather than speak out in ways that would be deemed unacceptable, thus preventing their thoughts and actions from ever entering the historical record. Imagine growing up in a world where from childhood, you are taught that a woman's greatest asset is her humility and her quiet demeanor. Daughters were often instructed to speak only when spoken to defer to male authority figures, fathers, brothers, husbands, and priests. Proverbs and popular sayings of the time frequently reiterated these expectations. For instance, the ideal woman was often described as being like a well-governed house, quiet and orderly, suggesting that her influence should remain within the domestic sphere and her outward expression should be controlled. To be loud or argumentative was seen as unbecoming, even scandalous for a woman, regardless of the validity of her argument. This societal pressure was not just abstract, it had very real consequences. In public gatherings like town meetings, court proceedings, or church assemblies, women were often relegated to the sidelines, if present at all. While noblewomen might attend court, their primary role was often seen as ornamental or supportive, not as active participants in political debate or strategic planning, even if they possessed such capabilities. If a woman dared to interject or offer an opinion in such a setting, she might be met with disdain, mockery, or be swiftly silenced by male attendees. This informal but powerful social policing effectively shut down avenues for women to express themselves in contexts where their words might actually be recorded. Consider a village in 1182. If a dispute arose over land or a debt, it would be brought before a local lord's court or a village elder. The plaintiff and defendant, usually men, would present their cases. If a woman had a claim, she would often need a male representative to speak on her behalf, or her testimony would be viewed with suspicion if it contradicted a male witness. Her emotional expression might be interpreted as irrationality, whereas a man's anger might be seen as righteous indignation. This subtly undermined the credibility of women's voices within formal structures where records were kept. A woman's reasoned argument, therefore, often faded into the background, unheard or unrecorded in its original form. Even within families, where women undoubtedly held significant sway, their influence was often exercised subtly, through persuasion, negotiation, or managing the household, rather than through direct commands or public pronouncements. A wife might advise her husband on business matters, or a mother might guide her children's education, but these conversations were private. They rarely left the confines of the home to be documented in a charter or a chronicle. Domestic sphere, while crucial for daily life, was largely invisible to the record keepers who prioritized events in the public, male-dominated arena. So while women were undeniably active agents in their private lives, the social norms of the time meant these actions and voices were deemed too insignificant for the formal historical record. Furthermore, the concept of honor played a huge role. A woman's honor was inextricably linked to her chastity, her modesty, and her adherence to prescribed gender roles. To speak out of turn, to challenge authority, or to engage in public discourse in a way that was perceived as aggressive or unfeminine could jeopardize her reputation, and by extension, the reputation of her family. Fear of social censure, of being gossiped about, or of bringing shame upon her relatives was a powerful deterrent to women voicing their independent opinions or challenging the status quo. This meant that many women, even those with strong opinions or innovative ideas, learned to keep them private, confined to trusted female friends or silent reflection, rather than risking public condemnation. Religious teachings also heavily reinforced these social norms. The New Testament, particularly the epistles of Paul, contains passages that were widely interpreted to mean that women should remain silent in churches and be submissive to men. While these passages are subject to varying interpretations today, in the medieval period, they were often taken literally and applied broadly to women's conduct in society. Clerics preached sermons emphasizing female humility and obedience, and these teachings were absorbed by the populace. So when a woman was encouraged to be silent, it wasn't just a social expectation. It was framed as a divine commandment, further solidifying the pressure to remain unheard. Think about forms of expression that were available to women. Some women engaged in oral storytelling, singing, or weaving intricate tapestries that conveyed narratives. These were culturally significant forms of expression, but they were often ephemeral or lacked the permanence of written records. Folktale passed down by a woman from generation to generation might be lost if not written down, or transformed as it passed through male hands. Tapestry, though visually rich, cannot capture the direct words or nuanced arguments that a written document can. These female-dominated forms of communication were often dismissed as less important or less authoritative than the written word, further marginalizing women's unique ways of expressing themselves. Even in rare instances where women did speak out, such as in the case of mystics or visionaries, their voices were carefully curated. A woman who claimed to receive divine revelations, like Hildegard of Bingen, though she was exceptional and wrote extensively, often had her visions scrutinized and approved by male ecclesiastical authorities. Her words might be recorded, but they were often framed within a male theological discourse, emphasizing her humility and obedience to the church, rather than her independent spiritual authority. If a woman's visions or prophecies did not align with orthodox teachings, or if she was perceived as too assertive, she could be dismissed as deluded or even heretical, ensuring her voice was not only unrecorded but actively suppressed. The very concept of public versus private life was gendered. Men occupied the public sphere, the market, the court, the battlefield, the church hierarchy, where decisions were made and records were kept. Women, regardless of their social standing, were largely confined to the private sphere, the household, the family, the community of other women. While their contributions within this private sphere were indispensable for the functioning of society, this sphere was largely invisible to the chroniclers who documented events in the public realm. Daily negotiations of family life, the management of servants, the raising of children, the care of the sick, these were the vital labors of women, but they rarely generated official documents or chronicles. In conclusion, the social norms of 1182 created a powerful, invisible cage around women's voices. They were taught to be silent, to be obedient, to defer, and to remain largely within the domestic sphere. This widespread expectation, reinforced by religious teaching and the threat of social disapproval, meant that many women self-censored or chose not to participate in public discourse in ways that might have led to their words being recorded. The absence of women's voices in the historical record is not just about what was written, but also about what was never spoken aloud in the first place, stifled by the weight of societal expectations. Number 3, economic dependency and lack of public role. In 1182, the economic structures and public roles of society were overwhelmingly dominated by men, creating a deep-seated dependency for women that severely limited their opportunities to create or influence historical records. Without independent economic means or a sanctioned presence in the public sphere where records were generated, women's contributions, even vital ones, often remained unacknowledged in the written history of the time. This wasn't just about individual women, it was a systemic issue rooted in how wealth, power, and formal authority were organized. Feudal society, which was the prevailing system across much of Europe in 1182, was built on relationships of land and loyalty. Land ownership, which conferred status and power, was almost exclusively held by men. While women could inherit land, particularly in the absence of male heirs, or hold it as part of a dower or jointure after marriage, their control was often limited. A woman who inherited land might find herself under pressure to marry quickly to provide a male guardian and manager for the estate, often losing direct control over its operation. Property rights were primarily vested in the male head of the household, the father, husband, or brother. This meant that any significant economic transactions, such as the buying or selling of land, the granting of feudal rights, or the signing of contracts, were almost invariably conducted by men. These were precisely the kinds of events that generated charters, deeds, and legal documents, the very building blocks of historical records. Without independent economic agency, women had little direct engagement with the formal processes that produced these documents. Consider the burgeoning urban centers of 1182. Guilds, which regulated trades and crafts, were becoming increasingly powerful. While some women worked in various trades, as brewers, bakers, spinners, weavers, or even running small shops, their participation was often informal or restricted. Women were typically excluded from the formal leadership of guilds, which set rules, managed apprenticeships, and engaged in public displays of wealth and influence. Guild records, which meticulously documented members, apprentices, rules, and economic transactions, therefore rarely featured women as independent actors. If a woman ran a successful brewing business, it might be recorded as the alehouse of William and his wife, effectively subsuming her economic identity under her husband's. Even if she was the primary operator, the official record gave credit to the male head of household. Financial transactions, beyond simple daily purchases, were also largely male-dominated. Loans, large-scale trade agreements, and investments were handled by merchants, bankers, and landholders, who were overwhelmingly men. Financial records of the time, account books, ledgers, and promissory notes reflect this reality. A woman might contribute her labor, her ingenuity, or her domestic management skills to a family business, but the formal financial instruments, and therefore the financial history of the period, would bear the names and decisions of men. This means that while women were integral to the functioning of the medieval economy at a practical level, their economic agency was rarely reflected in the written records that preserved this history. Moreover, formal public roles were almost entirely closed off to women. Kings, nobles, bishops, abbots, and town magistrates, these were the figures whose decisions, pronouncements, and activities were diligently recorded by chroniclers and clerks. Women could not serve as judges, legal advocates, or military commanders, with very few, often exceptional, exceptions like countesses who held specific feudal obligations. They were not members of royal councils, parliamentary bodies, which were nascent but still male-dominated, or town councils. The archives of royal courts, municipal governments, and ecclesiastical bodies, therefore, reflect a male-centric power structure, because these were the spaces where public power was exercised and documented. Even for powerful noblewomen, their influence was often indirect, exercised through their relationships with male family members. The queen, while immensely influential, often operated behind the scenes, offering counsel to her husband or sons. Political maneuvering, her diplomatic efforts, or her strategic advice might shape major events, but the official records would typically credit the king with the decision. For instance, a royal charter might be issued by the grace of the king, even if the queen had been instrumental in advocating for its content. Her voice, in such a situation, was absorbed into the male authority. This lack of public role meant that women were largely excluded from the formal processes of record-keeping. The scribes who wrote down history were primarily documenting the activities of the men who held public office or commanded armies. Women, by societal design, were largely absent from these formal arenas. This wasn't necessarily an active conspiracy to erase women, but rather a reflection of a societal structure where women's contributions were simply not deemed relevant to the public record, or they were seen as domestic, private, and therefore not history-worthy. Consider the role of women in the church. While women could become nuns and abbesses, their authority was typically circumscribed. An abbess might manage a large and wealthy convent, commanding respect and resources, but her power was ultimately subordinate to a male bishop or abbot. Her legal agreements, spiritual directives, or letters, if preserved, would still be subject to male ecclesiastical oversight and interpretation. The records of the vast majority of parish churches, cathedrals, and dioceses were maintained by male clerics, reflecting male concerns and male power hierarchies. The spiritual lives and administrative talents of countless nuns and abbesses, while profound within their communities, rarely translated into publicly accessible historical records that captured their individual voices or decision-making processes. Even in professions where women's knowledge was vital, such as midwifery and herbal medicine, their expertise rarely entered the written record. This was practical knowledge, passed down orally from woman to woman, from mother to daughter. The male-dominated universities and medical schools, which were just beginning to establish themselves as centers of formal medical learning, did not admit women. The medical texts produced by these institutions, written in Latin, reflected the knowledge of male scholars, often dismissing or failing to acknowledge the vast body of practical empirical knowledge held by women. So the voice of a skilled midwife, who could undoubtedly save lives and perform complex procedures, remained unwritten and therefore largely erased from the formal history of medicine. In summary, the economic dependency of women and their exclusion from formal public roles in 1182 meant that they were largely absent from the very processes that generated and preserved historical records. Without independent control over property, without participation in formal guilds or political bodies, and without a sanctioned public presence, women's voices were effectively silenced in the official archives. Their immense contributions to family life, economic production, and community well-being were vital, but they were confined to a private sphere that rarely intersected with the public sphere of written history, leaving their stories largely unrecorded and their voices unheard by future generations. Number 4, education and literacy barriers. One of the most powerful and insidious ways women's voices were erased from the historical record in 1182 was through systemic barriers to education and literacy. In a period when knowledge was primarily disseminated and preserved through written texts, the inability to read, and especially to write, directly prevented women from creating their own records, documenting their experiences, or leaving behind their own perspectives. This was not just a matter of individual skill, it was a societal structure that limited access to the very tools of historical self-preservation. Formal education in 1182 was largely a male prerogative. Universities, which were beginning to emerge in places like Paris, Bologna, and Oxford, were exclusively for men, primarily training them for careers in the church, law, or administration. Cathedral schools and monastic schools, which were the main centers of learning, also primarily educated boys and young men. Curriculum focused on Latin, theology, rhetoric, and logic subjects, essential for those who would go on to be scribes, scholars, clerics, or royal administrators. Girls simply were not admitted to these institutions, and therefore, they were denied the foundational skills necessary to become chroniclers, legal clerks, or even diligent record keepers of their own lives. For noblewomen, education often took place at home or in convents. While some noblewomen might be taught to read, particularly devotional texts in Latin or vernacular languages, the emphasis was often on spiritual instruction and practical household management. Writing, especially the complex skill of composing in Latin and mastering the scribal hand, was far less common. A noblewoman might learn to read the Psalter, but she was unlikely to be trained to write the kind of detailed accounts or letters that would enter a historical archive. The purpose of her literacy was typically for personal piety or managing a large household, not for public discourse or record keeping. So while a queen or a countess might be able to read a document, it was almost always a male scribe who drafted it for her. Her direct written voice, her own thoughts put to parchment by her own hand, are exceedingly rare for this period. Even for women who entered convents, the situation, while slightly better than for laywomen, was still constrained. Some convents were centers of learning, where nuns might study Latin, copy manuscripts, and even compose religious texts. However, the intellectual output of convents was often limited compared to male monasteries, which had direct links to university scholarship and often larger libraries. Moreover, what was written by nuns was often theological or devotional in nature, intended for their own community or for spiritual guidance, rather than for broader historical documentation. While remarkable figures like Hildegard of Bingen did emerge from convents, writing extensively on theology, natural history, and music, she was an extraordinary exception, whose intellectual contributions only survived because of a combination of her unique genius, powerful patrons, and the dedicated efforts of male scribes who helped compile and disseminate her work. Her exceptionalism highlights the rarity of women's independent written voices in the medieval world. The vast majority of women in convents, even if literate, did not have the means or the opportunity to create records that would be widely preserved. For the vast majority of women, commoners and peasants, literacy was practically non-existent. Their lives were centered on manual labor, family, and community, with little to no access to formal schooling. Knowledge was passed down orally, through song, story, and practical instruction. While this oral tradition was incredibly rich and vital to their culture, it was inherently ephemeral. A woman's vast knowledge of herbal remedies, agricultural practices, or local customs, passed down through generations, remained unwritten. When a famine struck in 1182, or a new agricultural technique was adopted, the male chronicler might record the event, but the detailed knowledge and practical ingenuity contributed by peasant women in adapting to these changes would remain an unwritten history. Their lived experiences, their insights, their voices, were simply not captured in the written documents of the time. The very tools of writing were also a barrier. Parchment was expensive, ink was labor-intensive to produce, and quills required skill to wield. These were not common household items. Access to these materials, along with the time and quiet space needed for writing, was largely restricted to elite male institutions, monasteries, royal courts, and increasingly, university scriptoriums. A peasant woman, after a long day of labor in the fields or managing her household, simply did not have the leisure, the resources, or the training to sit down and pen her memoirs or a record of her community. This logistical barrier, combined with the educational one, formed an almost insurmountable obstacle to women's self-documentation. Consider the types of documents that survived from 1182: charters, legal records, chronicles, theological treatises, and administrative documents. These are all products of a highly literate, male-dominated world. They document the actions and thoughts of those who could read and write, and who had the authority to commission such writing. If a woman had a strong opinion on a legal matter, her words would be filtered through a male scribe who recorded her testimony in a specific legal format, usually in Latin, and often summarized. Her direct, nuanced voice, her individual turns of phrase, her emotional appeals, would be lost in the process of transcription by a male legal clerk. The very concept of a personal archive, or private papers, as we understand them today, did not exist for most people, and certainly not for women. Letters, if written, were primarily for official or essential communication, not for personal reflection or detailed daily accounts, and even these letters would often be dictated to a male scribe. The idea of a woman keeping a diary or writing her memoirs was practically unheard of, not just due to the lack of skills, but because such activities were not deemed appropriate or important for women. Who would read them? Who would preserve them? The societal value placed on women's written contributions was minimal. This systemic barrier meant that when historians today look back at 1182, they are overwhelmingly encountering male voices. The laws, the theological debates, the chronicles of wars and royal successions, the philosophical discussions, all are predominantly written by men, for men, and about men. Perspectives of women on these same events, their interpretations, their struggles, their triumphs, are largely absent because they lack the means to record them. Not that women didn't have profound thoughts, or unique insights, or critical perspectives on the world around them. It's that the tools of articulation and preservation were denied to them. In essence, the lack of widespread education and literacy for women in 1182 acted as a silent but formidable censor. It prevented women from becoming the authors of their own history, from leaving behind their own direct testimonies, and from shaping the narratives that would define their era for future generations. The historical record, therefore, remains a vast library with an entire section of voices missing, the voices of women, silenced by the very barriers that shaped their lives. Number 5. Medical and scientific erasure. In 1182, a significant amount of medical and scientific knowledge, particularly concerning childbirth, healing, and herbal remedies, resided with women. However, this vast body of practical, empirical wisdom was largely excluded from the formal written records of the time, leading to a profound erasure of women's intellectual contributions to health and the natural world. This was due to a combination of factors: the oral tradition of knowledge transfer among women, the nascent male-dominated institutions of formal learning, and the prevailing societal view that women's knowledge was folk or superstitious rather than scientific. Imagine the village midwife in 1182. She was likely the most knowledgeable person in her community about childbirth, women's health issues, and early childhood care. She possessed a deep understanding of human anatomy relevant to labor and delivery, honed through years of experience and passed down from her own mother or a female mentor. She knew which herbs could ease pain, stem bleeding, or induce labor. She understood the signs of various illnesses affecting women and children, and she had practical solutions that had been tested and refined over generations. This was a sophisticated system of knowledge, vital for the survival of the community. Yet, this knowledge was almost entirely transmitted orally. It was learned through apprenticeship, observation, and direct experience. There were no formal midwifery schools in the written sense, no textbooks authored by women detailing their methods, and no records of their cases or medical insights. When a male scholar in a monastery or a fledgling university wrote a medical treatise in Latin, he would draw on classical Greek and Roman texts, or the emerging Latin translations of Arabic medical works. Practical, hands-on, and often highly effective knowledge of the local midwife was almost never incorporated into these formal, written medical works. It was dismissed as informal, unscholarly, or simply beneath the dignity of academic inquiry. Consider the use of herbal medicine. Women were often the primary gatherers, cultivators, and practitioners of herbal healing. They knew the properties of countless plants, which ones could reduce fever, which could treat wounds, which could aid digestion. This was empirical science, derived from careful observation and experimentation over centuries. They understood dosages, preparations, infusions, poultices, salves, and applications. This botanical and pharmacological knowledge was immense. However, like midwifery, it was largely an oral tradition, passed from mother to daughter, from healer to apprentice. When male scholars did write about herbs, they often did so within the context of abstract theories of humors or pre-existing classical texts, rather than directly documenting the empirical practices of local women. For example, a male-authored herbarium might list plants and their properties according to ancient sources, but it would rarely cite the practical knowledge of the local wise woman who actually used them every day. The sophisticated medical insights held by women were thus detached from the formal written medical discourse, and their intellectual contributions in this vital field became invisible. Formalization of medicine in the medieval period was a male-dominated process. Universities that taught medicine were, as previously mentioned, exclusively for men. These institutions focused on theoretical knowledge derived from ancient authorities like Galen and Hippocrates, often prioritizing intellectual debate over practical application. Physicians who were university-trained men often looked down upon the unlearned healers and midwives, viewing their practices as unsophisticated or even superstitious. This academic prejudice meant that even if a woman had profound medical insights, she lacked the platform and the formal training to commit her knowledge to a written text that would be recognized by the scholarly community. Furthermore, the very nature of medieval society, with its strong religious beliefs, sometimes led to the mischaracterization of women's healing practices. While in 1182, the widespread witch hunts of later centuries had not yet begun, there was an underlying suspicion of women who held independent knowledge, especially if it seemed to challenge male authority or traditional structure. A woman who was exceptionally skilled at healing might be viewed with a mix of awe and suspicion. While most were respected, the potential for accusations of sorcery, however rare in this specific year, was always a background risk. This underlying tension might have further discouraged women from overtly documenting their practices or engaging in public discourse about their medical knowledge. The knowledge of diet and nutrition also largely resided with women. They were responsible for preparing meals, preserving food, and managing the family's provisions. They understood the nutritional value of different foods, the importance of seasonal eating, and methods for safe food storage. This practical knowledge of dietetics, crucial for health in a time of scarcity and disease, was an integral part of their daily lives. Yet it was never formally documented in the same way as a royal decree or a land transaction. The voice of the woman who knew how to keep her family healthy through careful meal planning remains unheard in the historical record, while the detailed records of male-run monasteries' food supplies are often preserved. Even in the realm of domestic hygiene and public health, to the extent it existed, women played a primary role. They were responsible for cleanliness in the home, managing waste, and caring for the sick. Their understanding of practical sanitation and basic nursing care was vital in preventing the spread of disease. This was often an intuitive, experience-based knowledge, honed through necessity. Yet, no medical treatise from 1182 details the practical hygiene practices of medieval women or their contributions to limiting disease in their households. Formal scientific records of the time focus on theories of disease and learned diagnoses, not the daily, life-saving practices of women. In summary, the medical and scientific knowledge held by women in 1182 was vast, empirically sound, and vital for the health and well-being of medieval society. However, because this knowledge was primarily transmitted orally, rooted in practice rather than formal scholarship, and often viewed as feminine or folk rather than academic, it was systematically excluded from the written historical record. Burgeoning male-dominated institutions of formal medicine and science failed to incorporate or even acknowledge the immense intellectual contributions of women in these fields. This resulted in a significant erasure, silencing the voices of countless women who were, in their own communities, the true experts in health, healing, and the practical application of natural science. Number 6. Ecclesiastical control and narrative. The Church, as the dominant intellectual, moral, and often political institution in 1182, held immense power over what was written, preserved, and disseminated. Pervasive influence meant that narratives concerning women were meticulously controlled, often filtered through a lens of male clerical authority and specific theological doctrines. This control led to a significant erasure of women's authentic spiritual experiences, intellectual contributions, and independent agency within the religious sphere, unless they conformed to prescribed roles or were interpreted by male guardians of orthodoxy. Monasteries were the primary centers of learning and record keeping in 1182. Monks meticulously copied manuscripts, wrote chronicles, and maintained archives. These institutions were male-dominated, and their theological teachings often presented women in highly idealized or problematic archetypes. On one hand, women were elevated as the epitome of purity and spiritual devotion, like the Virgin Mary. On the other, they were viewed with suspicion, as inheritors of Eve's sin, prone to temptation and moral weakness. This dualistic view permeated clerical thought and influenced how women's lives and actions were recorded. When a woman, even a saintly one, engaged in religious activity, her story was often shaped to fit these pre-existing narratives. If a woman experienced visions or claimed divine revelations, as some mystics did, her experience would be carefully scrutinized by male confessors, bishops, or theologians. These clerics would determine if her visions were orthodox and beneficial to the church. If they were, her story might be written down, but it would often be framed in a way that emphasized her humility, obedience, and passive reception of divine grace, rather than her own active interpretation or unique theological insights. The male scribe would interpret her experience through his own theological framework, effectively mediating and controlling her voice. For example, if a woman expressed a complex theological thought, the scribe might simplify it, or attribute it to divine inspiration rather than her own intellectual process, thus subtly diminishing her intellectual agency. Nuns, while living a religious life dedicated to God, were also subject to male ecclesiastical authority. Abbesses, despite their significant administrative and spiritual power within their convents, were ultimately accountable to male bishops or abbots. Their letters, if preserved, would often be formal communications concerning property, administration, or spiritual guidance for their sisters, but rarely would they reveal the full scope of their political maneuvering, their personal struggles, or their independent theological reflections. While some abbesses, like Hildegard of Bingen, managed to record their own extensive works, her ability to do so was due to exceptional intellectual gifts, powerful connections, and the active support of male scribes and patrons. Her extraordinary life underscores how difficult it was for other women to achieve such a voice. The majority of nuns, even learned ones, found their intellectual and spiritual expressions confined to the internal life of the convent, rarely documented for wider dissemination. The Church also controlled access to knowledge through its vast libraries. Texts available for study were overwhelmingly written by men, church fathers, philosophers, theologians, and classical authors. Women had limited access to these scholarly resources, and even if they did, the curriculum was designed by men and for men. This meant that women's intellectual development, particularly in theology and philosophy, was often stunted compared to their male counterparts, making it harder for them to produce written works that would be deemed authoritative or worthy of preservation by the Church. Furthermore, the moral teachings of the Church reinforced the social norms that encouraged female silence and submission. Sermons preached in churches across Europe in 1182 would have emphasized women's duties as wives and mothers, their need for male spiritual guidance, and the virtues of modesty and obedience. These messages, repeated week after week, deeply influenced perceptions of what was appropriate for women. A woman who challenged these norms, who spoke out against injustice, or who pursued independent spiritual paths that deviated from the Church's sanctioned forms, risked being labeled as disobedient, prideful, or even heretical. Such women's voices would certainly not be preserved. Instead, they might be actively suppressed or condemned. The very concept of a spiritual biography of a woman was often filtered through a male gaze. When a holy woman's life was chronicled, the male hagiographer, saint's biographer, would select events and traits that reinforced the Church's didactic purposes. Her struggles, her doubts, her unique spiritual insights might be downplayed in favor of highlighting her miracles, her pious suffering, or her adherence to monastic rules. Inner life and individual spiritual journey, in its raw form, often remained unrecorded or reinterpreted to serve a broader theological agenda. Even within the context of marriage, which the Church held as a sacred institution, women's voices were often muted. While marriage was a sacrament, the legal and social reality of it often meant a woman's identity was subsumed by her husband's. Church courts, which handled matters of marriage, divorce, and spiritual discipline, would record legal arguments and decisions, but these records would largely reflect the male legal framework and the male voices of the parties involved or their representatives. A woman's specific concerns or her emotional experiences within the marital union would rarely be the primary focus of these official records. The Church's role in regulating public expression also played a part. Public debates, theological discussions, and formal pronouncements were almost exclusively the domain of male clerics and scholars. Women were not permitted to preach, to teach publicly in a theological capacity, or to hold significant positions in the ecclesiastical hierarchy that would allow their voices to be recorded as official pronouncements. This exclusion from official religious discourse meant that their perspectives on faith, morality, and salvation, though undoubtedly profound and diverse, were not incorporated into the written theological history of the era. In essence, the Church in 1182, through its control over literacy, its institutional structures, its theological doctrines, and its role as the primary preserver of written records, exerted a powerful influence that shaped and often silenced women's voices. Women's spiritual experiences were mediated, their intellectual contributions often ignored or reinterpreted, and their independent agency curbed. The historical record, therefore, primarily reflects a male clerical perspective on faith, morality, and the nature of God, leaving countless women's profound spiritual journeys and intellectual contributions largely untold. Number 7. Legal disenfranchisement. In 1182, the legal systems across Europe, whether based on feudal customs, nascent common law, or canon law, profoundly limited women's rights and autonomy, thus effectively silencing their voices within the formal mechanisms of society. Women were legally dependent on men, meaning they could rarely act independently in legal matters, initiate lawsuits, or stand as credible witnesses without male guardianship. This widespread legal disenfranchisement meant that their concerns, testimonies, and actions were either unrecorded or filtered through the authoritative voices of men, leading to a massive historical erasure. Consider the concept of coverture, a legal doctrine that, while more fully developed later, had its roots firmly planted in the medieval period. Under coverture, a married woman's legal identity was largely subsumed by that of her husband. She could not own property in her own name, enter into contracts, or sue or be sued in court without her husband's consent or representation. Her legal personhood became absorbed by his. So if a woman had a dispute over land or a claim to an inheritance, it would be her husband, father, or a male guardian who presented her case in court. The legal records would reflect the actions and words of the male representative, not the woman's own arguments, strategic thinking, or emotional appeals. Actual voice, her direct interaction with the legal system, was systematically eliminated from the formal record. Even unmarried women, though technically possessing more legal independence than their married counterparts, faced immense challenges. A single woman, a femme sole, could own property and engage in some legal transactions, but she often lacked the social standing, economic resources, or legal expertise to navigate a male-dominated legal system effectively. If she brought a case to court, her testimony might be questioned more readily than a man's, or she might struggle to find powerful male advocates to represent her interests against well-connected male adversaries. The records would show the outcome of the case, but the nuances of her struggle, her voice in presenting her side, would largely be absent. Inheritance laws further reinforced this dependence. While women could inherit property, particularly in the absence of male heirs, various customs and laws often favored male succession. Primogeniture, the system where the eldest son inherited everything, was increasingly common, leaving daughters with dowries or dower rights rather than direct control over landed estates. Dower rights, which provided a widow with a portion of her deceased husband's land for her lifetime, were a form of provision, but they did not grant her full ownership or control. Control over this land was temporary and dependent on her husband's prior ownership. Legal records regarding these land transfers would detail the male lines of inheritance and ownership, rather than the ongoing management or wishes of the women who might temporarily hold the land. Women were largely excluded from holding public office, which was inextricably linked to legal authority. They could not be judges, sheriffs, royal officials, or members of legal councils. This meant they had no direct role in creating, enforcing, or interpreting the laws. The legal documents generated by courts, royal chanceries, and local administrations were products of a male-only system. The legal voice of the time was exclusively male, and any influence women had was informal or through male intermediaries. Consider the records of manorial courts or local feudal courts. These courts handled disputes among peasants and tenants, often concerning land, labor, or minor crimes. While women might appear as parties in these disputes, their involvement was often limited. If a woman was accused of a crime, her defense would often be presented by a male family member. If she was a witness, the scribe would record her testimony, but often filtered through the lens of male authority and legal precedent. Her specific tone, her individual words, her emotional nuances were rarely preserved, reduced instead to a formal summary that fit the existing legal framework. Canon law, the law of the church, also shaped women's legal standing. While canon law offered some protections for women, especially concerning marriage and personal morality, it also enshrined male authority within the family and the church hierarchy. A woman could appeal to church courts for redress in cases of marital abuse or breach of promise, but these appeals were still adjudicated by male clerics, and the resulting records reflected the church's established legal procedures and doctrines, not necessarily the woman's full, unmediated narrative. The church's view of women, influenced by theological texts and societal norms, often presented women as morally weaker or more easily swayed, which could subtly undermine their credibility in legal proceedings. The simple fact that legal documents were almost exclusively written in Latin and drafted by male clerks meant that women, largely illiterate in Latin, were detached from the very language and process of the law. They might hear their cases interpreted to them, but they could not read the legal arguments, challenge the wording, or contribute directly to the written record. This linguistic barrier further solidified their legal disenfranchisement and ensured their voices remained absent from the formal legal archives. Even in cases of petitioning, where a woman might seek a lord's favor or royal intervention, her petition would typically be drafted by a male scribe or official. Content would represent her request, but the formal phrasing, the legal arguments, and the presentation would be shaped by the male hand. Her direct plea, her specific reasoning, her individual perspective, were often diluted or formalized to fit the expectations of the male authority receiving the petition. In conclusion, the legal systems of 1182 were designed by men, for men, and operated overwhelmingly by men. Women's limited property rights, their general inability to act independently in legal matters, and their exclusion from legal offices meant that their direct voices and perspectives were largely absent from the vast archives of legal records. Whether in a charter, a court plea, or a contractual agreement, the legal identity and agency of women were subsumed by male authority, resulting in a profound and systemic erasure of their experiences from the historical record. Their influence was often vital, but their official legal voice was systematically denied, leaving their stories untold in the intricate tapestry of medieval law.